Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and joining us once again is Stephen Miles. He is Advocacy Director of Win Without War, a coalition of groups that has been active since the invasion of Iraq, trying to turn our... Well, I'll let him describe in a sentence what you guys do. Stephen, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, happy to be here.
Well, we're always glad to have you, and just for our folks who haven't met you before on the show, in a sentence or two, what do you guys do?
Sure. So the Win Without War Coalition is a coalition of about 36 national organizations, all multi-issue organizations that came together to work specifically on national security, war, and peace issues. Originally started in 2002 in the run-up to the Iraq War, and today continues to advocate for a progressive foreign policy.
Excellent. Okay, great. Much better than I would have done. And Stephen, one of the reasons why I wanted to bring you on the show this week was because we had good news last week. We had the news of a breakthrough in the what they call the 5+1, the multi-nation negotiations with Iran over Iran's nuclear program. The an outline of the deal looks very good from from our side. That is to say, there's a lot of emphasis on negotiations, a lot of or rather inspections, a lot of conditionality on the part of the five nations in terms of relieving sanctions when there's evidence of progress and so on. So this seems like a good deal, and it's a very good deal not to be in the other two alternatives for the Iran situation, which is either no deal and continued nuclear development or war. So all in all, the initial reaction, I think, of the international community and folks like ourselves was this is a great thing. Now there's pushback, as one might expect. The Republicans are against it. But what I wanted to talk to you about today, Stephen Miles, was the fact that some Democrats seem to be lining up against this bill too. What's going on with that?
Well, so there's been a number. First, we should acknowledge you're 100% right. The Republicans have been diehard set against diplomacy with Iran for years. It's an interesting position considering the Bush administration tried at times and woefully failed. But Republicans have lined up and are much more interested in pursuing a war with Iran than negotiations. But you're right. A handful of Democrats, and unfortunately some prominent Democrats like the theoretically leader-elect Chuck Schumer, Senator Menendez, who recently got himself in the news for some unpleasantness, and a handful of others have been very, very vocal in opposition to diplomacy through the years. These folks have tried a number of different creative ways through the years to pass legislation that in one way or another would have been detrimental to our negotiators. And at the end of the day, we shouldn't be surprised that they're continuing to do this. What should be surprising and troubling is there's a new group of senators in the mix now, folks like Senator Tim Kaine, who have kind of bought into this lie that Republicans are selling, that this is somehow all about reasserting Congress's role and just having congressional overview. You know, no one who's watched the Republicans and their invitation to Prime Minister Netanyahu, the letter from the 47 Republican senators to the Iranian leaders, or pretty much anything these guys have done since Barack Obama became president, can think that they're operating in good faith. And the legislation that is going to be heard in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee next week by Senator Corker is just another attempt to undermine the president. And it's a shame that some of these Democratic senators have gotten fooled into supporting it.
Well, and let's unpack that a little bit, because you mentioned that Senator Menendez was one of the leading opponents of a negotiated deal with Iran, and you said that he's facing a little unpleasantness right now. I would say 16 counts of unpleasantness, if I recall correctly. And we've got now Corker, obviously Republican, pushing to stop this bill. And just for some background, and you correct me if I'm wrong, Stephen Miles, Win Without War, but presidents can make executive agreements all the time. They are frequently binding, particularly when they're involve multiple nations, as this one does. So this is not a power grab. This is not a new thing for this president to be doing. Understandably, a Republican like Corker would oppose this bill, because anything that's good news for a Democrat, they oppose, even if it was initially a Republican initiative. So that's understandable. But with Menendez out of the way, what is you think is motivating senators like Tim Kaine to? I read and we shared. I think we both read the interview with Greg Sargent in the Washington Post with Tim Kaine, senator from Virginia, Democrat, where he attempts to justify his position. And frankly, it didn't make sense to me. He was all over the place. He didn't have a clear, as you say, he tried to argue that this is congressional review, but really something else is going on, isn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely something else. I mean, look, well over 90% of agreements like this are executive agreements that are not, they're not treaties. This is not a treaty. It's not something that needs to go through Congress and be ratified. It's also worth noting it's not just an agreement between Barack Obama and the Iranians. This is what the Republicans would like you to believe, because they think that by making it seem as something as though it's Obama, they can play into people's dislike of the president or feelings that the president, if he was just somebody stronger, could have gotten a better deal. This is negotiated, as you said, by the six leading powers, the U.S., China, Russia, the French, the Germans, and the British. And it was all their foreign ministers who were in Switzerland negotiating this. So to somehow believe that you could get a better deal, as the Prime Minister of Israel repeatedly says, you have to believe that those six foreign ministers who are pretty good at what they do. That's how you get to be something like the foreign minister of China, Russia, France, Germany, UK, that they somehow all got rolled. Not just one of them, not just Barack Obama and John Kerry got a fast one pulled on them. Somehow the entire international community had a fast one pulled on them. So it really bears mentioning and just stressing that this is an international agreement. It's not just something. And that's one of the reasons it's so dangerous for Republicans to be trying to say what they're saying, which is, well, we want to have the ability to tweak the deal. This is hard-fought diplomacy. It was negotiated in the wee hours of the morning over months and months and months of negotiations. And the last thing in the world we need to do is add 535 more negotiators from all places, the dysfunctional United States Congress, to that negotiating table. I mean, I don't know anyone who thinks that Congress should be the one deciding things. They can barely pass their own budgets. They can barely keep the lights on, particularly congressional Republicans. So
well, I don't know, Stephen. When I think of sensitive diplomacy involving multiple parties and cross-cultural issues, I immediately picture Ted Cruz sitting at the negotiating table. Look, we know where the Republicans are coming from. I guess what I'm struggling with is you've got Tim Kaine and you've got maybe, 8 or 9 other Democrats co-sponsoring the bill that would basically put a block on this deal. What's their motivation? What's their angle? It seems clear to me, reading, for example, what Kaine has to say, that they're playing politics with this. Are there big campaign contributors that want this deal blocked? Is it the demographic, ethnic, religious? Is it who are they playing to? Because as far as I'm concerned, they're not playing to the best interest of the American people or their party, for that matter.
So I think we have to kind of separate two groups, because for some reason Senator Kaine is kind of off by himself on this, and he's been good on other issues of diplomacy with Iran, and so I think he just got kind of wooed by Senator Corker, who is a very seemingly reasonable guy, and bought into what Senator Corker was selling. For the most part, I think many of the other ones, it's not coincidental that when you look at who were the senators with the closest ties to AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, who were the closest tied to some of the large donors who tend to stress Israeli interests and tend to be very close to Netanyahu and the Likud government. And I want to stress, it's not, sometimes they throw around and these people are colloquially called pro-Israel. It's not pro-Israel. It's very much being pro a particular right-wing aspect in Israel. We have a huge movement here represented by J Street that's very much in a different place on this issue.
Well, of course, and we also have the fact that a lot of us think that the extreme policies being pursued by Likud are not even good for Israel. They're self-destructive. Yeah. And you have the fact that Likud is pretty much, and Netanyahu have pretty much come out and allied themselves with the Republican Party against the Democratic Party. And so there again, I don't see where these guys are coming from unless it's the influence. You say Kane's out on his own. I believe that. But unless it's the influence of the kinds of campaign donors and interests that you outlined, that's the only thing I can think of. We got about a minute left in this segment.
Yeah, I mean, it's super close. And when you hear the Prime Minister of Israel come to Congress and say what he said, and you see the talking points they put out, folks who have, like Senator Menendez, who have aligned themselves, and Senator Schumer with those interests, are going to kowtow. But we should remember, this is the same person who was adamantly wrong, 100% wrong about the Iraq War, said it would be great for the region, would sow democracy around the region. And frankly, not only was it bad for America and our interests, it was quite bad for Israel. And Prime Minister Netanyahu was dead wrong about that. He's dead wrong again, and it's dangerous, and it's problematic that some of these senators are choosing to side with him instead of the American president.
And we also have now a new senator, Tom Cotton, telling us that if we did go to war with Iran, it would just be over in a couple of months anyway. So what's the problem? So let's break right here. We'll be right back after this with Stephen Miles from Win Without War. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on The Zero Hour. I'm Richard Eskow, and we are talking with Stephen Miles, Advocacy Director of Win Without War. And we've just been talking about the 8 or 9 Democratic senators who are aligning with the Republicans in blocking or delaying the Iran deal that the president negotiated with 5 other countries and Iran. Now, just to close the loop on that, I guess I would say from an activist point of view, are there places people can go online to find out who these senators are and let them know how they feel?
Sure, absolutely. So there's a couple resources. Obviously, you can always go to our website, winwithoutwar.org. Just for this issue, we've launched a new website, nowarwithiran.org, nowarwithiran.org or .com. They both work. And we have that website full of resources about this agreement. You can sign a petition to Congress about this issue, and you can get in the system so that we'll send you emails about when the votes are coming up in Congress and how to get in touch with your member of Congress.
Great. Thanks so much. And while you're here, Stephen, I wanted to ask you about one other thing that caught my eye, which is defense spending. You know, we're going again into these discussions where I find myself, for example, in my own work, rebutting the same old stories about Social Security as benefit cutting season comes around again. People try to cut Social Security. People try to cut Medicare. People say we can't afford to repair our crumbling infrastructure in this country. People say we can't afford the Small Business Administration to create the kind of companies, on and on and on. So, but here's what gets no attention from the talking heads in Washington. For example, and this is just an example, you have in the Los Angeles Times this week, the Pentagon's $10 billion bet gone bad. And it's a talk about projects that flopped, leaving a hole in Homeland Defense. Now, what they're really talking about was a new super radar. The sea-based X-band radar, XBX, would spot incoming missiles, track them through space, and guide U.S. rocket interceptors to destroy them. Crucially, this system would be able to distinguish between actual missiles and decoys. Now, it's been a $2.2 billion flop. The whole airborne lasers, complete to part of this multi-billion-dollar flop. On and on and on. You know, there are multiple disadvantages to being old, as I'm beginning to experience as I get older. One of them is watching history repeat itself all over again. You know, when Reagan introduced the whole Star Wars defense idea and the magical dome of technology across the United States, I remember all sorts of smart engineers saying, no, it's not going to work. It's not going to work because of this. Not going to work because of that. They were shouted out of town. They weren't visionaries. They didn't understand what technology can do. Now, 35 years later, same crap, different day. We're still dealing with technologies Is it true that they didn't know it wasn't going to work, or is it that they don't care if it's going to work? It doesn't matter if it works or not, just that the money gets spent.
Well, I think it's first of all, it is a monumental amount of waste, and it's not just the $10 billion on the missile defense programs you mentioned. Just over the last 15 years or so, it's well north of $50 billion just on weapon systems that have been canceled. That's money that you then don't have to put into weapon systems that do work, that the men and women who were fighting the wars over the last 15 years could have used. It's also money that we don't have back here at home when we're going through the tough economic times we are. It's a combination of kind of colossal failures on the part of the Pentagon, on the part of Congress, and I wouldn't say colossal failure on the part of the contractors who are making these weapons, but a colossal grifting of the American taxpayer that we let them get away with. These guys have, it doesn't matter to them whether or not they actually ever deliver something that works. The longer they work on these projects, the more money they get. The more the costs that go up, the more money they get. You know, they don't lose money when their projects go over budget the way you or I would lose money if we were renovating our house and that went over budget. They simply get more money. They simply have cash fall down from Congress. And as you said, Congress takes it from everywhere else. You know, if you wonder why there's less nutrition assistance, if you wonder why there's less money for the types of programs that have built the middle class over the last 100 years, that there's not the money for that now, it's because it's being wasted at the Pentagon on these boondoggles that simply don't work. And frankly, even if they did work, they wouldn't do particularly much to keep us safe, some of them.
Right. I mean, we face a different world with a different kind of threat. So let's talk about that for a second. We're talking with Stephen Miles from Win Without War. One problem that you're putting your finger on, I think they call it cost plus contracting, where it doesn't. The more you run up, basically the more money you make. So there's no real incentive to control costs, and it amazes me that our thrift-minded, supposedly Republican Party isn't all over this. But it also amazes me that I shouldn't say amazes me. It disappoints me that our Democratic White House has not tried to step in through the Defense Department and say no more of these types of contracts. We want you leaving aside, and we'll get to the other topic you raised of whether these are even worth the money, but what's stopping them from saying, no, we don't do contracts this way anymore? If you tell us a missile system is going to cost $2.2 billion, that's what you get. If it costs $3.3, you lose.
Sure. I mean, very, very little is stopping them. To the Obama administration's defense, they've made some progress on the issue, but not nearly enough. And frankly, what we need is some bold leadership from some politicians who would not just talk about limiting the contracts and the cost overruns, but would talk about things like the fact that the CEO of Lockheed Martin, the world's biggest defense contractor, they pretty much do one thing, and that's sell weapons to the American government. They also sell some weapons to other governments, but usually the American government actually pays for those. So around about 83% of their money comes directly from the U.S. taxpayer. Another 16% or so comes through foreign sales, much of which we finance. So they pretty much do one thing, work for us. And what do? They make billions and billions of dollars in profit that they give to their shareholders, and they pay their CEO pretty much like he's a Wall Street banker. He gets the type of executive compensation every year, or she now, I should say, that, you know, would make them amongst the most well-paid bankers on Wall Street. And that's our tax dollars. That's the only place they're getting money. So what we should have a conversation of, and this is the time for these types of conversations as we're looking ahead to a presidential election, we should have bold leaders who are willing to step up and say, let's not just try to tinker around the edges, but let's fundamentally think how we're allowing the American taxpayer to be fleeced. Let's fundamentally change this. And the thing that we have to do to have that conversation is admit that there's a problem, and that problem starts by saying over and over and over again, the problem isn't that we don't spend enough money on the military. The problem is that the Pentagon is full of corruption, it's full of waste, and that you will only fix that when you stop throwing more money at the problem.
You know, it sounds a little bit like a 12-step program. The first step is admitting you're powerless and you have a problem. and it's become unmanageable. So
Yeah.
I think that you raise a great point there, but and it amazes me that, as I say, that it hasn't been done. But then, of course, it doesn't amaze me because defense contractors throw around a lot of campaign cash. If you're a general in the Pentagon, in the military, or a senior official in the Pentagon, you've got a great career waiting for you for very big dollars once you leave government service. If you're a member of Congress or a senator, same deal. You've got those board seats and on the boards of directors and those consultancies and those other jobs, senior vice president of this or that. So there is, to me, frankly, it stinks of corruption. And maybe you don't want to go that far, but that's the word I would use. It's legal, but it's corruption.
Oh, I would 100% go that far. It's absolutely corruption. I mean, I don't know what other words you use for an industry whose sole purpose at this point is to take money out of the American taxpayer's pocket and deliver incredibly poor return on the investment. A lot of the time, as we were talking about at the beginning of the show, we get literally nothing at the end of the process. I mean, billions. Republicans want to talk about these guys getting lobster on food stamps for $10 or something like that. Like, what? Why? They never want to mention $10-20 billion spent on a weapon that we ultimately cancel and don't have one operable unit of. That's not money that just disappeared into the air. It's money that went into somebody's pocket. It's money that went into a corrupt system's pockets and was lining lots and lots and lots of pockets that go right back to politicians in terms of campaign donations. So there's no other way to describe it other than corruption in my mind.
Yeah, and that's a lot. By the way, that's a lot. $20 billion is a lot of lobsters. And the other side of this is what makes it even more horrible, in my opinion, is that people who work in this industry, people who align themselves within government toward this kind of industry, members of Congress and so on, they really, and this sounds like hyperbole, but in my opinion, they then get into the habit of selling death, in effect. You have these NBC and other commentators who aren't often identified, these retired generals who say, well, this is why we need to go to war in Iraq. This is why we need to strengthen our military presence here. This is why we need to prepare for a military confrontation with Iran. And what's not mentioned, although a couple of people like Rachel Maddow have begun to do it, but what's usually not mentioned is a senior vice president at Raytheon or consultant here, consultant there. So, in effect, whatever they think or feel in their hearts, these are people who are actually promoting death and violent conflict that lines up with their financial interests.
Sure. You're absolutely right. I mean, people listening to the show are very familiar with tuning into CNN or MSNBC, some maybe even Fox. And they see retired so-and-so was a general or an admiral. Some of them are very admirable people, but it's not about that. But those guys are getting paid to be on these shows and getting paid by these contractors. And everyone knows the story of the few generals who ever dared to say things like, maybe there's some waste in the Pentagon. They get called in the next day and they get fired. And so people don't do it. People don't mention those things. And instead they talk about the wars that are going on, and they become very, very good advocates, whether they mean to or not, for this perpetual war machine that we have.
Well, I think it's time we had more people standing up and confronting them on that stuff. We have a couple minutes left. Stephen Miles, Win Without War. And I also was curious to know if you had any updates for us on the situation in Yemen. Is there anything there? The last we heard, the Houthis, who were a Shiite minority group, I guess roughly a third of the country, had taken over the government. Now there's talk about Saudis counterattacking and what we should be doing and all that stuff. Any updates there we need to know about?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a couple things. So I think the first thing, just to preface this and include myself, is that anyone who tells you that they know what's going on in Yemen, that they have a simple solution for what's going on in Yemen, they're full of it. They're completely lying. It's a deeply, deeply complex problem. This is a country that divides along tribal lines. It has regional implications in terms of a regional power struggle, and it's very, very hard from afar to have a good sense of just literally what's happening on the ground, but also the forces that are at play. So I preface this by saying take it even my comments with a grain of salt, but particularly folks who want to tell you things like this is the rise of Iran and they're now in control. Take all of that with a very big grain of salt. It's simply not true. What we do know about the conflict is that an ongoing conflict between a number of different factions, one of which is these Houthi rebels who have had some ties and some support from the Iranians, but now also seem to be very closely aligned with the former president of Yemen, President Saleh, who folks may remember was thrown out as part of the Arab Spring. President Saleh was replaced by President Hadi. President Hadi was forced by the Houthi rebels, who were aligned with the former president, to flee to Aden and ultimately flee the country. Through that process, the Saudis began to intervene militarily, along with the Egyptians and some others. They have both naval resources and are flying air sorties over the country and dropping significant munitions. They're causing significant civilian casualties. There's a really troubling amount of death and destruction going on. And much of it, it's worth noting, is being fueled by climate change and by the dwindling of particularly water, but in general resources in Yemen. Yemen's the poorest country in the region, and its cities its people are literally running out of water. Its second major city, I believe, will be without any water, within a couple decades. They already have roughly a day and a half's worth of water usage every month. That's all.
Well, and I think that's very, very important. I'm really glad you brought in the issue of water. I was looking at a Columbia study that says that water is an element in the Syria conflict as well. These are the kinds of things we don't think of when we think about war and conflict. We think of huge weapon systems and not
right.
the earthbound things that are really driving some of these conflicts. Listen, thank you so much for coming on the show and updating us. Stephen Miles is the Advocacy Director of Win Without War. And Stephen, as always, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much. Have a good one.
You too. Now, I just want to make a couple closing remarks. First of all, I'm noticing that this word grift is coming back into the national conversation, and I'm so glad to hear it, because there are so many areas of our political and government life today where grifters are dominating the national conversation. And certainly the military budget is a huge part of that. When grifters tell us that it's time for war, no matter what party they belong to, beware. When grifters tell us that we can give blank checks to military contractors but have to rob the health care and benefits of elderly people, beware. When grifters tell us don't worry about an issue, it's already been settled, beware. You know what? It's the year we need to start expelling the grifters from our political life. I'm RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.